I'm speaking at Trinity College with Fernando Bettancourt, who works with the Collectivo for Puerto Rican Independence. He professionally works for a social service agency in Hartford, Connecticut. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Delighted to be here in your show.
Let's talk a little bit about this question of independence and so on. How did Puerto Rico become a possession of the United States?
It was as a result of the Hispanic-American War in 1898, and after the invasion of the United States of Puerto Rico in 1898, the United States took possession of Puerto Rico, and it has remained a colony ever since. We have never been anything but a territory of the United States.
I was reading Juan Gonzalez's book, and he said, I think it was 1917, all of a sudden Puerto Ricans were granted citizenship, but the entire legislature said no and voted unanimously against it and thought it was just a way of getting cannon fodder for World War I.
That is correct. The legislature, the only body that was elected by Puerto Ricans back then in 1917, unanimously rejected the U.S. citizenship, but it was imposed in what is known as the Foraker Act, and the Jones Act came in 1917 and imposed the U.S. citizenship, and that's why we are American citizens. However, it is important to understand that even though we are American citizens, Puerto Ricans living in the island do not have the right to vote for the president. We do not have any senators or representatives in Congress. And the only representation is what is called a representative from Puerto Rico that has no vote. Only they can speak.
We're talking about more people than live in Connecticut and probably 10 or 15 other states.
Oh, absolutely. If Puerto Rico were a state, we would have more representation in Congress than 25 existing states. And that's why it's almost impossible to have full support for a state for Puerto Rico, because many states will not like that will have 2 senators and more representatives than they do. But more importantly, if you bring it to what is currently happening, this whole issue of passage of the Promesa law that is an affront to our people, people understand that what Puerto Rico is going through is a human crisis, but this crisis started before this law was passed. For instance, Puerto Rico has lost more than 500,000 of its inhabitants due to migration, particularly to the United States, in the last 11 years. And the consequences of this huge debt is not the responsibility of the Puerto Rican people, but the structure that have kept us as a colony with no power, no say, but able to engage in that.
Who took on this debt? I mean, was it stupid people, crooks, or was it just sort of desperate people?
No, absolutely not. Over the years, for decades, these investors took advantage that Puerto Rican bonds have one of the highest rates and gradings. So they took the advantage, and when that grading went down, then they took advantage of the differential in terms of you're taking more risk, but then you get more interest on the debt. But for instance, one thing that people don't know in Puerto Rico or in the United States is that Puerto Rico was eligible, even as a territory, to have the bankruptcy law apply in Puerto Rico. In 1984, Congress, without consulting Puerto Rico, without consulting the government, took Puerto Rico out of the list of the states and territories that law applied. So now we don't have the benefit to have that protection against this crisis that was created, which I have to say, by irresponsible overspending over many decades by the 2 parties that have administered the colony in Puerto Rico.
Now, your Collectivo calls for independence. Could Puerto Rico go it alone and be an independent country?
Absolutely. There's no formula in the entire world that determines what country is successful or not by size. If we were to use that, then Brazil should not be independent, but Switzerland should be, or vice versa. And there's no comparison. And that is another myth that unfortunately have affected the minds of many Puerto Ricans. We believe that we have the capacity, like any other country in the world, to determine our state of affairs and be successful as any other country. However, if you do not have the basic principle of having the sovereign powers to determine how you organize your society, that we know that is a recipe for not being successful.
Now, I don't know a lot about this, but I know there's been some votes over the years about this, and recently the pro-independence gets a small vote. Is that right?
Well, what happens is that, first of all, there has never been in the history of Puerto Rico under the United States, not a single referendum that has been sanctioned by the Congress of the United States. So what we have are these elections in Puerto Rico that they call plebiscites or referendums about the Puerto Rican status. Sometimes the Puerto Rican pro-independence forces have even abstained, and when we have participated, yes, we are about 5% or 6% of the total vote. However, our contention is that that is artificial because none of those voting know what they're voting on, because the United States have not determined and describe what specifically each formula of status, future status of Puerto Rico means or entails, or what are they willing to accept. So Puerto Ricans are basically going and giving a blank check with no resolution, and the status quo continues.
And is it legal to call for independence? I know for some years it wasn't legal.
Well, for many, many decades, it was illegal. If you were to just even have your Puerto Rican flag in your lapel, you can be incarcerated, like many did. Recently, we have one person, for instance, among others, which is a political a prisoner, Oscar Lopez, and we are asking for his liberation because there you have someone who was accused of sedition. However, nothing was proved against him. He never recognized the jurisdiction of the United States, and he has been more than 35 years incarcerated for the only sin of supporting independence for Puerto Rico. And on this point, we have unanimous consent. In other words, Puerto Ricans who defend statehood, Commonwealth, or independence are in favor of his incarceration. I mean, leave him free.
And the last question, so on Promesa, what does the Collectivo say should replace that if it was knocked down?
In 1953, the United States told the world through the United Nations that Puerto Rican has achieved self-definition and self-determination. And now the three branches of government, Supreme Court, the executive with the President Obama, and the legislature, the Congress, have said no, Puerto Rico is just a territory. So what we're saying is Promesa is just an euphemism trying to mix words to give this hope that this is promise, that anything can be resolved in Puerto Rico. But how could you do that when in fact you have people who are not elected by the Puerto Rican people having full powers over everything that has to do organizing our society and determining what needs to be paid first? That is, actually, the United States had a revolutionary war on the principle of no taxation without representation. So if that applies to Americans, it should apply to Puerto Rico.
Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you. My pleasure.